Yossi, welcome. It's such a
Thank you.
pleasure to have you on Raw.
Well, it's great to be with you.
How are you feeling today?
Today specifically, or today since October 7th?
Like, what's the general 1 to 10 hopefulness scale?
In the short term, 0. I
Uh-huh.
In the middle term, 8 to 9.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that makes me, by Israeli standards, a raving
A
optimist.
unicorn.
Yeah, yeah. But oh,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely. And I say the midterm, not the long term, because in Israel you never think in the long term. It's really day to day here. But at this point, I am in despair about where this government has taken us on every level, moral, political, strategic, in terms of our internal cohesion. This government is sum total of the parts of Jewish history that were disasters. And we're being forced to look at those aspects of ourselves, our collective persona, the ugliest side of the Jewish people. That's embodied in this government. So in terms of right now, you ask how I am right now. We say in Hebrew ala panim, which I love in English, on the face. I
On
think
your
it
face.
I think it really
Like
should
you've
be.
fallen flat on your
Yeah,
face.
I think it should be an English proverb. How are you feeling? I'm on the face. But in the middle term, which is to say the next couple of years, I I have a very deep confidence in our ability to begin slowly turning this around. I think this government is going to leave lasting damage in its wake, and it will take us years to recover, if at all, from some of the moral and institutional failures and corruption that the government has brought. But a clear majority of Israelis don't like what they're seeing, want change, and want healing. I think that in the end, that's going to be the decisive issue, the great divide. Are you for continuing this, or are you for healing? And we have two models. We have October 6th and we have October 8th. October 6th, we were tearing each other apart. And October 8th, we instantly pivoted from the lowest place in our schism in the history of the state to one of the peak moments of our unity. And we've never done that before. We never made that pivot from tearing ourselves apart to pulling together. We've had moments of national unity in the past, but we weren't coming from that place that we were in on October 6th. We weren't coming from the abyss. So that gives me tremendous hope. October 8th is really the model. But we have a government of October 6th, a government that's committed to tearing us apart and that feeds off of our schisms, that draws its power, that animates its base with hatred of their fellow Jew. And we've never seen anything like that in the history of the state. So right now we are in an October 6th situation, but that's not where a majority of Israelis want to be. So yeah, I'm an optimist.
I like that you ended with I'm an optimist after
But an
after
Israeli, but an Israeli version of optimism. The Israeli version is, as bad as you think it's going to be in the coming months, it's probably going to be even worse. That's an Israeli optimist. After that, we're going to slowly start to heal.
at some point Eliyahu Hanavi will arrive.
I think he's here already. And that's what you see in the polls. The polls consistently show strong majorities that don't want this.
You just mentioned before this interview that you wrote an essay about meditation, that you've been meditating for 40 years. You have such an interesting kind of parallel world where on the one hand you're really deeply involved in thinking about Israeli identity, Jewish identity, narratives, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And on the other hand, you have a meditation practice, which I see it as a kind of superpower where you can kind of sometimes take a step back and look at this whole great tragic comedy of humanity from slightly more distance. You talked also about the very, very deep trauma of October 7th and how in some ways it's been unparalleled since the Holocaust, and how it pushed that survival button, which automatically pushes people into a very, very tribal place that doesn't really allow for us to see the other. And yet you wrote this book, Letter to My Palestinian Neighbor, and you have this history of really thinking about the other side as well. I'm just wondering, like, have you really struggled internally as well, or are you kind of solid on who you are and what you believe in?
Oh, struggling all the time. And the Palestinian issue is a good starting point for that struggle. October 7th sent us right back to our most primal and vulnerable place. And and I'm still there, and I'm still struggling against it because I don't want to be there. I feel diminished by my inability to feel empathy for the other side. And right now, I'm frozen. I'm still frozen. It's a year and a half later, and I do feel my humanity is diminished, and my Jewishness is diminished. But it's really hard to have control over that primal place. I think that this is something that I've been trying to understand. And my in a way, I guess my day job is trying to understand the Jewish psyche. And something became clear to me the other day, which is that we never fully emerged from the Shoah. And of course, people can't fully emerge from that experience. But it wasn't only the past. The Shoah didn't end in 1945. The fact that we have been fighting for our right to exist since the creation of the state, since day one of the creation of Israel, is one of the greatest outrages in Jewish history. That the Shoah didn't end the Jewish struggle for the right to exist. It only changed it. It shifted it from the right of an individual Jew to exist, the right of the Jewish people as a collective to exist, to the right of the Jewish state to exist. But the profoundly offensive question of what Europe used to call the Jewish question, and today is called the Zionist question, which is, do Jews have the right to exist in whatever form? And it never stopped. Now, I think that the Jewish people was so overwhelmed with joy and gratitude in the early decades of the state. And I know that that's certainly how it played out in my family and with the survivors that I knew growing up. There was this sense of vindication. The state was the answer. And whether that's historically precise, whether anything could really be the answer to the Shoah is a separate question, because Jews experienced it emotionally, viscerally, that the state was the answer. And power was the answer to total powerlessness. And so we tended to downplay the fact that we were still struggling with the question of survival, because we won. And then 1967 happens. And the first time I visited Israel, I was 14. I was with my father. That was the summer when the Jewish people believed that the Holocaust was really over. That's it. We won. And of course, we're in the post-October 7th reality now. What I'm trying to say is that October 7th made explicit something that was there all along, but which we hadn't fully faced, which is that we're still struggling. Our right to exist is still under challenge. And so that, I think, is that's what we're responding to.
I heard you talking also about your teenage sons. They assumed that Israel was secure, and they had this kind of real strength, kind of psychological strength. And then October 7th happened. And I think for a lot of people, including myself, I realized that the Holocaust and the messages that I'd heard from my grandparents and their hiding and their families, it was somehow almost imprinted in my DNA. The kind of, it awakened this just primal existential terror from which I didn't kind of come out for several weeks, and which is still there to some extent. And every comment I read online, which delegitimizes the feelings, the fear that we have, it kind of reawakens that a little bit. I was
Well,
wondering if,
but Anouk, you really have an extra layer of Holocaust trauma, having grown up in Europe, and I can't imagine what that would have been like. It was hard enough growing up in Brooklyn with the Shoah, with survivors, to grow up in the middle of where it happened. How do you begin to dig your way out of that? That's a question to you.
yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't actually thought about that. I think so much of it was just subconscious. There was no discussion about, how is this affect? It was just this kind of transparent, abstract presence, which in a way was always there but never fully mentioned. And I think we all kind of pushed it deep into our subconscious, which of course it will always emerge at time of existential threat.
Thanks for re-traumatizing me.
I heard your interview that you did about a year ago already with Ezra Klein from the New York Times, and I thought all the things you said were so compelling and nuanced and intricate and complex and balanced. And then made the mistake, which I cannot help myself. It's some kind of like self-flagellation of seeing the comments on the video, and so much of it is just so misinterpreted. Do these things affect you? Like someone said, well, if you fear for your own security, why don't you just move to Nebraska? I mean, you're American, you come from there. And then they said, yes, you have an indigenous claim from 2,000 years ago, but the Palestinians have an indigenous claim from 2 generations ago.
and
If,
now
if you
and
were,
and and now we have an indigenous claim, or we have re-indigenized ourselves. So where do you go with that, Mr. Anti-Zionist?
I was just wondering, where does your resilience come from? Because in this day and age, and since October 7th, just talking about Israel, and again, I really thought it was thoughtful. It was someone grappling with something so terrible and still trying to kind of keep their humanity and explain their side in a balanced way. And yet talking about Israel or Judaism or Zionism or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is so contentious. Do you ever dream of just leaving Israel, just like it's too much, it's too hard? What that guy said is true. You could live in Nebraska and live safely, and your kids could. Does this affect you to the point where you ever think about that, or are you just so proudly, Zionist, and do you have a very strong backbone? Because I'd like to learn from those kinds of backbones.
I I don't think that it's primarily about pride. I'm very proud, of course, of the Jewish story, and especially of the mid 20th century Jewish story of recovering from the lowest point in our history and reaching what I think is the peak point of Jewish history, even now, in terms of our power, our prestige, our ability to defend ourselves, our centrality on the world stage. We've never been so important in good ways and bad ways. I mean, obviously, the fact that we're under global assault is the dark side of that success. But I think that our mid 20th century story of survival is the greatest Jewish success in 4,000 years, and I never took that for granted. I was always aware growing up that I was the first generation that was born immediately after the Shoah, and also that was born into the reality of a Jewish state. And that the consciousness of being born after has defined my Jewish life, my identity. So yes, there's certainly pride there, but I maybe the deeper level is a sense of responsibility, of awe at living at one of those very few pivotal moments in Jewish history when the Jewish story is being decided. What is this story? It's being decided anew. And I've always felt this sense of responsibility and burden and gratitude all wrapped into one, of being a citizen of the Jewish people at this moment, of being entrusted with the Jewish story at this moment. And being a writer is an added burden and responsibility. The only story I've ever been interested in writing about from when I was a kid is the Jewish story, because that seemed to me the most extraordinary, the most powerful story. And I've always tried to understand what it is. And I've always loved writing about individual Jews and about the collective Jewish psyche. So what really keeps me bound to Israel is this sense of responsibility to the story. And again, there are different, for me personally, there are different layers of responsibility. And being a Jewish writer is one of the main areas of responsibility, the main arenas in which this responsibility plays out.
Do you ever think, like, if you were not Yossi, but Jay Smith in somewhere in the United States or the United Kingdom or wherever, looking at the news right now and seeing the kind of unfolding horror that has been happening in Gaza, do you feel like, those comments that I mentioned, where people just really seem to just have an inability to understand the existential fear that has been awakened in Jews and Israelis, and the perhaps at sometimes irrational or primal response? Do you feel like you can understand what a lot of people are saying?
Obviously, we're focused on all the details and nuances of the conflict that we're stuck in, but that's not true for most people. How much did any of us really pay attention to Serbia, to Rwanda? I still get the protagonists confused. But do I have opinions? Yeah, I kind of think the Serbians were genocidal. Do I really know? No. Do I know which side, what the history of the conflict in Rwanda is? I have no idea. But I have a kind of general sense that one side committed genocide against the other. If you enter this conflict, on October 7th, uh, then okay, the Palestinians really behaved badly, but weren't they being occupied or something? Wasn't there that going on? And then look at this Israeli government. They're such a nasty bunch. And who's that guy who says that they should throw out all the Palestinians? And don't they have this politician who's an extreme right wing? So it's very easy to put together a portrait of Israel that's not the Israel we know, and that's not the conflict we know. So there is that. But of course, there also is the phenomenon of people who've gone deeply into this conflict and still come out with that position, including some Jews, which for me is the most painful part of the whole assault against us is really the the,
Yeah,
the, the
just
Jewish
talking
the
about,
Jewish enablers.
right. I think just because we mentioned Europe and the United States, I find that a lot of those Jews are in the United States, and that
Yeah.
European Jews kind of more deeply understand the
Yes.
existential threat that they would be under. It sounds far-fetched and Orwellian to people who aren't Jewish, but regardless of whether it's true or whatever happened or not, European Jews really deeply feel that fear that I think a lot of American Jews still don't feel.
Oh, I think you're right. And we tend to talk about an Israeli diaspora crisis, but that's actually not true. There's an American Jewish Israeli crisis. The rest of the diaspora, everywhere, is more or less aligned with Israel, because of the feelings of vulnerability, because of a closeness to Holocaust survivors. Australian Jewry, for example, or Canadian Jewry is heavily survivor families, to say nothing, of course, of Europe itself.
I want to talk a little bit more about what you said about fearing for your own humanity. And I think, we talked about that kind of post October 7th trauma, which I think we both understood put the Jewish psyche in a place of survival. And when you're in a place of survival, you cannot be thinking or empathizing with anyone other than your own immediate survival and that of your family. As the war has gone on, we're a year and a half into the war. A lot has changed. Hamas has been greatly diminished and deterred. Hezbollah is diminished as well. Iran, and I remember at the beginning of the war, you said the war was a war of survival because the Jewish people needed to feel that they could have that deterrence again. That we needed to rise up and show the world that
and
we wouldn't just
especially the Middle East. Israel
yes,
can't survive in the long term in the Middle East without a credible deterrence posture.
right. A year and a half later, that deterrence has somewhat been reinstated.
Right, right.
Do you feel more moral conflict, inner conflict about the war? Do you think it should end at this point?
Well, the conflict that I feel is really over the hostages, and for the first phase of the war, I think most Israelis, I intuitively prioritized the need to destroy Hamas over the need to immediately rescue the hostages. And it's not something
Wow.
that I necessarily said explicitly. It was more implicit, but I
Mm,
felt this overriding need for us to undo the disastrous perception of Jewish weakness that was a result of October 7th. And the turnaround really happened with the beepers in Lebanon. And yes, you're right. We have to look at Gaza. Look at the footage from Gaza. Much of Gaza looks like Berlin 1945. How much more will we be able to inflict on Hamas? So that's one question. And as a result of the partial restoration of Israeli deterrence, and I emphasize partial because the Houthis, I mean, whoever heard of the Houthis? The Houthis are lobbing missiles at Tel Aviv. That doesn't strike me as a very impressive example of Israeli deterrence. The Houthis aren't afraid of us. So have we really restored our deterrence? It's an open question, but we've certainly proven that we have enough fight in us and that October 7th was an aberration. So what shifted for me is in terms of policy is the commitment to prioritize the hostages over bringing Hamas down. And something like 70% of Israelis, according to polls, are ready to end the war in exchange for bringing the hostages home. Now, that, of course, is not the position of this government, and that has positioned me uh, against the government on this issue, as well as all the other issues that I've been opposed to this government on. So, but you're really asking a different question. You're asking a question about the Palestinians. And so I ask myself the question, if Hamas wasn't holding our hostages, would I want to end the war because of Palestinian suffering? Or would I believe we need to keep going until we destroy Hamas? And I don't know the answer to that.
mm.
It's a really important question, but the truth is it's so theoretical at this point because most of us in Israel want to end the war for a different reason.
Mm,
But we do believe that the war should end.
mm. I really appreciate your honesty about your own internal thinking and feelings. And so many of us would not have readily admitted that at the beginning of the war, the kind of primal feeling was rage and going after Hamas as the kind of first priority. So thank you for sharing that also with the audience, because I think it really legitimizes
I would just qualify that by saying, yes, certainly rage was a large part of our post October 7th response, but there was also a very strong, rational, strategic component, which was objectively the need to reestablish the credibility of Israeli power. And that is an existential need for Israel. Not immediately. If we hadn't reestablished our deterrence, the country wouldn't have fallen apart, but it would have placed us on a downward historical trajectory. We would have been at the beginning, I think, of the unraveling of Israeli power. And so we had to do what we did. And the question is, do we have to still keep doing what we had to do then? And I don't know.
You lead the Muslim Leadership Initiative at the Hartman Institute, and I'm wondering if since October 7th you've been able to keep your relationships with Muslim leaders alive, or if that has just crumbled. Because I talked to other people who just, their friendships just went radio silent in the best case scenario.
Yeah. Well, my primary Muslim friendships and connections have remained intact, and the program that we ran for almost a decade at Hartman, which brought young emerging Muslim American leaders, North American leaders, to Jerusalem, to the Hartman Institute to study Judaism, Zionism, the conflict, was really extraordinary. I think it was unprecedented in the Jewish world. Hartman is an educational institute. We don't do dialogue. It was not a dialogue program. We taught young emerging Muslim leaders about Judaism and Zionism. And it was a year-long program. They came for 2 weeks.
I can't believe there were any of them had, were wanted to come. I would not have even expected that such a program
this
existed.
Was the miracle. This was the miracle of the program. We didn't initiate the program. Hartman didn't go out saying, let's find Muslims to teach. We didn't think it was possible. A group of Muslims approached us. They knocked on our door, and our response was the only possible response that a Jewish educational institution can do. You open the door. People are asking, teach us, let alone Muslims. And so we did. And we graduated close to 170 people over those 10 years. Many of them who became, in the course of this last decade, front rank leaders, opinion shapers in the Muslim American community. The bad news is that our relationship with many of them did not survive October 7th. Most were either silent because they were afraid of their position in the community, or actively participated in the assault on Israel and the accusations of genocide and downplaying October 7th. Or else, well, of course, we condemn murder of civilians. Civilians should never be combatants. But look at the numbers on October 7th and look at the numbers in Gaza. So what has happened in the Muslim world, not only in North America, but throughout the Muslim world, is similar to the reaction of much of the Muslim world to the Holocaust. There are the outright denialists. There are those who celebrate the Holocaust. And some of the denialists will say, well, it never happened, and we're glad it happened, and we're going to do it again. Right? Those who justified October 7th, those who relativized it. Well, yes, of course, it's terrible, but look what Israel's doing is so much worse. So my approach to Muslim-Jewish relations prior to October 7th was, I have no preconditions. I will sit with any Muslim who's willing to sit with me. And I've heard it all. I've heard everything from Holocaust denial and minimalization. I've really heard it all. And my position was, okay, we're at war. And if you're willing to listen to me, then I'll sit at the table and listen to you. After October 7th, I have much less tolerance for that. I won't sit with October 7th denialists or celebrants or minimizers or justifiers. And so that's considerably narrowed the scope of my ability to find Muslim partners. Again, my core Muslim partners are with me, and that's not to say it's easy, because they are severe critics of this war, but that doesn't make them Hamas apologists. They are bitter critics of Hamas. And I can easily live with Muslims who are Israel critics. I think that that's just going to be a given in Muslim Jewish interaction, provided that they are Hamas critics and not apologists and not minimizers. So that has really left the playing field much smaller for Muslim-Jewish relations than it was before October 7th.
Knowing the Jewish psyche as you do and the Israeli psyche, what would it take for this current Israeli society to open up again to the idea that there are many Palestinians who might be willing to just forego this whole dream of like river to the sea and would be willing to have a two-state solution and live in security and dignity alongside a Jewish state? Even if there were such a Palestinian partner, do you think today, post October 7th, and with the kind of propaganda of this government, that there are still many Israelis who would believe, who would have the empathy necessary to look at the other side?
You know, I understand the emotional reaction of Israelis after October 7th who said, there are no innocent Palestinians. They're all Hamas. As an emotional reaction, you saw the scenes as a visceral reaction. You saw the scenes of October 7th of thousands of civilians, Palestinian civilians, pouring across the border, participating in the massacre, celebrating and parading our hostages through the streets. You know, like I had these biblical images, you know, of Samson, a caged Samson being paraded through the streets of Gaza by the Philistines. You know, it was that primal, and thousands of people celebrating. But it wasn't Samson. It was 18-year-old girls. And so that experience was so primal that it was a natural response to say there are no innocents in Gaza. Now, what we've seen in the last few weeks is the clearest refutation of that, which was the outbreak of demonstrations against Hamas. Now, it's not for love of Israel. Let's put that aside. Let's put those illusions aside. We're enemies. I understand that. But the courage that it takes to demonstrate against Hamas, even with Hamas severely diminished, is extraordinary. And I know that there are Palestinians who are not just willing to live in peace with us, but who accept the idea that we belong in this land. Now, of course, they're a minority. They've been fed the opposite line by their media and schools and mosques. So it's really self-defeating for us to write off entire populations. We're going to have to keep living with these people, whether we want to or not. They're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere. Now, I think that a majority of Israelis understand that. And going back to your question, there was a poll that was taken a few weeks ago by Tel Aviv University, which really should have been headline news because it was such a stunning poll. If Israel were to make peace with the Saudis, and if there would be regional peace with the Arab Sunni world, would you accept a Palestinian state as part of that peace agreement? 60% said yes. Now, I was stunned because I really thought that post-October 7th, those numbers would be in the teens. And yet there it was. So I think that there's a common sense still among a majority of Israelis, which is a kind of a centrist instinct. And I've always identified myself as an Israeli with the center camp. And my understanding of the center is it's the camp of balance. It's the camp that tries to grapple with the terrible complexity of our problems, whether it's political, whether it's cultural. Israel is faced with a series of overwhelmingly complicated problems. And no one camp has all the answers, but each camp has a certain insight that we need. And so the center is the meeting point of the right and the left. And as a centrist, I have a left-wing side and I have a right-wing side. And my right-wing side says that we can't have a Palestinian state. And October 7th just proves that in the most in the most obvious way. My left-wing side says we can't continue the occupation. We can't live in one state with the people who did October 7th. We can't form one political entity with these people. Now, of course, then if you're on the far right, your conclusion is, well, then we expel them. But this is the 21st century. And if you expel several million people from your borders, you will not remain part of the club of successful nations. You will be a pariah state. And I don't want Israel to be a pariah state. So what do I do with that? As a centrist, I recognize that certainly for this foreseeable future, there cannot be a Palestinian state. But I also recognize that in the long term, the occupation is untenable. And so what do we do? That's the starting point. You need to look at reality without ideological blinders. And both the hard left and the hard right approach reality as a kind of a wish fulfillment exercise. I impose what I want reality to be on what reality really is. And it keeps blowing up in our face.
What do you do to nourish your soul these days? What has kind of kept you afloat?
There are the stock answers, which is, I believe in the eternity of the Jewish people, which I do, and it does provide a measure of comfort, although the last few years have really strained that comfort to the breaking point. And there's something that I've really been holding on to since the Netanyahu government came to power in 2022, even before October 7th. And that is that this government is forcing us to look at the dark side of our collective being. Every people has a dark side. And you can't go through 4,000 years of what the Jewish people went through without having strong residues of darkness. And this government is the coalescing of those subterranean dark forces. And we have no choice but to face it. This government is rubbing our faces in our own failures, our own dark impulses, whether it's hatred of the Goyim, that term that really should not be part of the Jewish lexicon anymore, whether it's us against the whole world. And sometimes it can feel that way, but objectively, it is not true on any level. There is a sense of taking chosenness in an extreme direction. All of these factors have coalesced in this government. And what has paradoxically given me strength is saying, okay, we're at that moment in Jewish history where we have no choice but to go through this. Do you know the Musar movement? There's a wonderful, wonderful saying that I've carried with me for most of my life from one of the great teachers of Musar, Yossi Horowitz, of the Navardic school. He was the Rosh Yeshiva of Navardak, and he said the following. He said, in the Slobodka Musar Yeshiva, they have a saying, what you can't go through, rise above. In Navardak, we say, what you can't go through, you must go through. And so the Jewish people is at one of those must go through moments. And what makes this so painful, so unbearable really, is that what we're going through is simultaneously an assault from without and from within. And that's what makes it so hard for so many of us to find solid ground.
Mm.
But what I hold on to is saying, okay, we're finally at that point in the maturation of the Jewish people where we're being forced to face our weaknesses. I wish we weren't being forced to do so while at the same time we're fighting an existential war. And the existential war we're fighting is not just military, it's also a war for our legitimacy around the world. So, in a way, we're fighting a three-front war. There's a military war against radical Islamism. There's a war for the legitimacy of the mid-20th century Jewish story of Holocaust to recovery. And that recovery happened because of Jewish power, and it's Jewish power that's under assault. And there is the internal struggle against those forces of dissipation that would turn us into the opposite of who so many of us believe we are or should be as a people, as an ancient people, as the repository of one of the world's great stories. So this is an extraordinary moment of truth for the Jewish people. And to walk away from this war, as some Jews apparently are, I don't blame them. But I can't, this is the moment I believe that our generation was being prepared for. This is it. This is what's that awful American expression? This is money time, right?
Mm.
So
my last question relates to that and what you said about the Jewish people who are walking away from this war. And I've said on this podcast before, especially in the first year of this war, my husband and I had constant conversations. I kept telling him, what about Portugal? What about Costa Rica? What about somewhere beautiful and green in the United States? And what about changing our name? And, I had these fantasies of walking away, and ultimately I decided to stay. I decided that my kids would grow up here. And yet I'm struggling like many people. It is a hard thing to do. It would be much easier for me to live in Portugal, as some of my friends are doing. What I want to ask you is where does your strength come from? Is it from your father's survival story? Do you think it's genetic? Is it your temperament? Do you think it is innate, or is it something that, we can all rise to the fore and embody?
Oh, well, certainly I was privileged to be raised in a survivor family. I don't know if I would have used quite those words to define that experience while it was happening, but in retrospect, no question about it. So yeah, that's certainly a big part of it. But I have a very strong spiritual practice. Meditation. I've been meditating for many years. It's a Jewish meditation practice. I've been part of a circle in Jerusalem of people who have gone deeply into the Jewish meditation experience, which has been largely forgotten in modernity, and I think needs to be resurrected. And I've been nurtured by Eastern religion. Vedanta, the monotheistic foundation of Hinduism, has been a very, very strong experience for me over the years. And I've been privileged to have teachers along the way who took me in hand. You can't really do it without teachers. Every spiritual tradition will tell you that. And it's true. Unless you've been reincarnated as some exalted soul, you're going to be overwhelmed by the material world, especially in our time. And so you need teachers, you need spiritual brothers and sisters, you need a group, you need spiritual friends to help strengthen you. And I'm blessed with that. And I would not have been able personally to hold on to a deep, it's not just a deep faith and hope. I would say it's more, I don't want this to sound arrogant, but a certainty. I just know that this isn't the end of the story. And I think many Jews share that. I think many Jews just intuitively know. So that's really what sustains me personally, in a very practical way, when I feel myself starting to fray. which happens a few times a day, and to keep from flying off the handle with every new bit of awful news, whether it's some new anti-Semitic outrage somewhere in the Jewish world, or some new outrage by this government, whatever it is, this convergence of threat from without and within. It's having that strong spiritual practice, which also, by the way, gives me a great deal of hope for the future of Judaism. Because if you look at the history of Judaism, I don't just mean the Jewish people now, I mean of the religion itself. When we went through periods of intense upheaval, there was usually a strong spiritual response. Not necessarily right away, sometimes a few generations later. Look at the outbreak of Hasidism after the Khmelnytsky massacres in Ukraine in 1648. It took a century or more for the Hasidic movement to begin to emerge, and the crisis of Sabbatianism. So many examples of Jewish history, Kabbalah after the expulsion of Spain, Lurianic Kabbalah. So there's a pattern in the history of Judaism of responding to crisis with deep spiritual movements. We are long past due for that response. And what happened in the Jewish people after the Holocaust was that all of that spiritual energy was really channeled by the need to physically reconstruct, to physically rebuild the Jewish people, to build the Jewish state. And it went into the practical reconstruction of the Jewish people. But there were tremendous spiritual energies that went into the practical rebuilding of the Jewish people. Those were still rebuilding, but the spiritual energies have been depleted. They've been exhausted. And where do you go now? And I think the only place to go, if you're asking yourself these questions, is back to Judaism, back to the core of Jewish identity for thousands of years until the 19th century, which was the struggle of a people with God. That's what the Jewish story is. And that story has either been sidelined by very powerful secular forces within the Jewish people or co-opted by fundamentalism. And we desperately need new sources of Jewish spiritual renewal. And really what makes me an optimist, Anouk, is that I believe that we are on the verge of the beginnings of a major new eruption in Jewish spirituality.
I really appreciate what you said, and I think that's one of the things that that drew me to make this podcast. After October 7th, I think the magnitude of it was so biblical, so transcendentally horrible that a lot of us, including me, secular Israeli living in Tel Aviv, needed to find some kind of new spirituality. And I had been studying Eastern meditation, but I needed it to come from my own tribe. And so I think that you're right, that probably a lot of people like me would be more receptive today to those kinds of ancient wisdom traditions that come from our own history. So you've given me hope as well, Yossi.
You and your podcast are a symptom of what's stirring. Listen to Israeli music today. So much of it is about God and the search for God, the disappointments, the God, are you really there? The struggle with God. And this is new. It's relatively new. It's the last decade. But since October 7th, it is really increased dramatically. And so there's now a desperation in Israeli society, which is also, desperation is the ground for many things. Politically, it can produce very bad results and is producing some very problematic results. But spiritually, desperation sometimes leads to very rich results. And so, Anouk, I'm really grateful to you. I'm grateful for your podcast and for strengthening my hope. You really have.
Thank you, Yossi.